Chaos is coming has been the catchphrase of the Dark Prince for the better part of 10,000 standard years, and never has it rang more true. Chaos will be the focus of the upcoming Champions DLC, meaty slab of content on the way we'll discuss more in depth tomorrow, alongside the now fully populated Immortal Empires map, but sliding under the radar has been an overhaul for the Undead, a battle rework that will dramatically alter their combat performance in Warhammer 3, and one that will dwarf even the Chaos changes in terms of their implications. By now, you would have heard that Vlad and Isabella can join each other's armies in campaign and multiplayer, and if you felt like it, you could even run them in your hero slots while Mannfred pilots the build as your legendary lord. But that's really just the tip of the iceberg, so today, I want to take a deeper dive into the vampire counts, what their changes will mean, and how they'll stack up against new and old in the capstone game of this trilogy. The purpose of this balance sweep, and it is a sweeping one, is essentially so they don't get face-rolled and embarrassed by demons. Given that both the Undead and Demons share the crumbling mechanic, and that factions like Khorne and Nurgle have substantially higher morale than the Coast or Counts in Game 2, CA felt like they needed some big changes to keep pace, and given that the Mono Gods will ultimately become some of, if not the strongest races in Immortal Empires, that was going to be a tall order. By the way, that is not a hot take. Knock on my door in 8 months, I'd bet at least 2 of the 4 Mono Gods are top 5 in both campaign and multiplayer. I think they're going to get really strong. So, substantial leadership bonuses across the board for the vampire counts, ranging from 10 to 20 in terms of base value, but representing 20 to 40% total increases in terms of their overall morale. Which means your skeletons, your zombies, your black knights, even your terrorgeists will do an even better job of holding the line and benefiting from that percentage-based healing, which we'll take a closer look at in a moment. And crumbling was already a strong mechanic, right? Now, I get why campaign players don't necessarily like it as much as routing, because your units will sometimes straight up die rather than retreating, and that means you have to re-recruit them. That's why you have powerful features like the Raised Dead pool and instant reinforcements on the campaign map. And from a pure combat efficiency standpoint, crumbling is inherently much better than routing, because they're still fighting, killing, and not giving up ground until the moment that last Skelly Boy takes a dirt nap. Undead units will never just roll over and die. They will not turn their back and flee and be run down by cavalry. They need to be put back in the grave themselves, and they're dealing damage back the entire time, which can't be said for the Cathayan peasants, who are now 8 miles away over the hill with poop in their pants. 10 to 20 extra leadership across your entire army may not scream off the page at you while you're playing, especially against a front line of enemy bloodletters, for example, who are still going to cut through you quite quickly, but I can promise you it will make a huge difference in the majority of your battles. An even wilder change, though, is the overhaul to Ethereal Units, and this is true for every single Ghost Regiment in the game, from the Lost Sylvan Knights for the Wood Elves to Syrenes for the Vampire Coast. But the Vampire Counts have the most Ethereals as a core part of their army, so this shift will impact them the most. Now, if Cairn Race, Hex Race, and Banshees had just been ported over to Game 3 with 0 changes, they would get absolutely dumpstered by Demons. I mean, they would just straight up melt to the sheer ubiquity of magic attacks, and they were hard countered. They would literally disappear in like 5 seconds flat if they engaged the wrong unit in Warhammer 2. So in light of that, physical resistance has been reduced by 20, down from 75% in Warhammer 2 to 55% in Warhammer 3, but they've received a corresponding increase in health, averaging around 23 HP per entity, which works out to around 1800 to 2200 extra health. On top of that, Ethereal Units come standard with the Frostbite contact effect now to represent their Deathly Touch, and their damage has been made exclusively AP. So they will slow you heavily and entirely ignore armor. Even the Green Knight does that now. He has full AP, 430 armor-piercing weapon damage, no base weapon damage whatsoever, and all that comes in even before applying debuffs like the Chilling Aura from the Hex Wraith Regiment of Renown. What this means is, alongside the leadership bonuses, Ethereal Units will be a lot less fragile and a lot more deadly. They're 100% AP now, they'll be great against armor, and they'll be much more effective when facing down magical attacks. And while they will still get their ass beat by demons in a melee grind for the most part, they'll make much better account of themselves against all factions in Immortal Empires, and will synergize even better with healing, which is probably the Vampire Count's biggest change yet. Vampire Count's healing, especially in blobs, is going to be disgustingly good. So, in Warhammer 3, heals are percentage based now, as opposed to flat baseline values of 4 or 8 HP per second. This means that the higher your total HP pool is, the more HP you are technically healing, because 0.1% of 10,000 health is more than 0.1% of 5,000 health. This is why Doom stacks of Minotaurs with Gore Feast, for example, are insanely good for Khorne. Percentage-based healing benefits units like this tremendously. So, here's an example of stacking essentially as many healing abilities as possible with Kemmler and the Stearnsman. The Chaos Tomb Blade from Heinrich Kemmler will grant 0.2 regen per second in an AoE while he's in melee. Unholy Lodestone from the Corpse Cart will grant 0.1 regen per second. Reliquary Binding from the Mortis Engine also grants 0.1 regen per second. Master of the Dead from the Necromancer, 0.1 regen per second. And Regeneration on the Stearnsman also gives 0.1 regen per second. So, in this scenario, the Stearnsmen are fighting Chaos Warriors and Chosen, elite infantry, and passively, without any Winds of Magic investment whatsoever, out-healing all incoming damage with 0.6 regen per second. They are regenerating 1.2% of their total health pool every 2 seconds, without any Invocation of Nehek, Blood Chalice of Bathory, any single target heals whatsoever. This is all passive AoE, which means it's affecting big chunks of your army too. That is way more health per second than you would ever see regened in Warhammer 2. Now naturally, there are counters to this, and you may not realistically invest that much into passive regen. Most builds probably aren't going to have a Mortis Engine and a Corpse Cart blobbed up unless this becomes the new meta, which by the way, it might very well do so. But against melee-only factions like the ones that exist in Game 3, this type of healing will be extremely potent, especially when facing down Demons or the Warriors of Chaos. Mortis Engine's typically not really the play against factions like the High Elves or Empire. It'll just be shot by artillery or by focus fire from archers. It'll blow up, you'll lose a huge investment. You can't dodge all those incoming shots. But in this case, against melee-only demon factions, they are going to be way more powerful, and this healing is going to be very effective in that type of role. And there's good and bad with that change, right? It's good that the vampire counts should have strong healing, and they should have tools for grinding you down slowly and being difficult to chop through as they continue their necromancy and raising the dead. But unfortunately, it might also be a problem, because optimal vampire counts play often makes for absolutely terrible battles to watch, especially against melee-focused factions. Hell, even Cathay is encouraged to counter-blob them with double Terracotta Sentinels and Celestial Dragon Guard in a big halberd box. Counts are, by nature, more susceptible to big, armored monsters because they don't have missiles to focus fire them down quickly. So, the vampire counts blob for huge heals, enemy factions blob against them to counteract those blobs, and their battles sometimes just evolve into this huge mess that doesn't feel very tactical or strategic at all. Blobbing, in my opinion, is simply not very skillful or micro-intensive, and I think it can be pretty horrible to watch. There's a reason Cairn Wraith and Crypt Horror Death Stars with infinite healing were taken out of the game. So it's a bit of a shame, because I absolutely adore the aesthetics of this faction, and they look even better in Warhammer 3. The models are outstanding. But even before this healing change, optimal counts play, especially with the Mortis Engine, made for really poor battles to watch. What I'm curious to see now is how they'll play in Domination, because that's a game mode where blobbing is at least somewhat harder to pull off, and they have all the tools for crazy capture weight and just swarming the field with cheap, massed infantry and taking over objectives. I've already seen some crazy builds that revolve around summon spam with Raise Dead, resummoning necromancers after they've used up all their zombies, and just trapping people in their spawn with fodder while you take over map control. Capture weight for zombies and skellies will be nerfed. They are not going to cap the same rate as Zargard, for example, and I think that's fair. I think Zargard should be able to cap, elite infantry in general, should be able to cap better than cheap fodder infantry, but that's explicitly because of how OP their fodder swarms would have been otherwise. But yeah, I do think they're going to be a force in Domination all the same, because it's a game mode that focuses heavily on infantry, and spamming infantry is something the counts are definitely very good at doing. With all that said, there are a lot of big changes coming to a huge portion of their roster as well, so let's go through line by line and look at how each troop choice will be affected by these stat changes. Starting off with Mannfred on his zombie dragon, dragons across the board in Immortal Empires have been buffed. Their mass has been almost doubled, from 2,200 to 4,000, so pushing out of melee fights should be a lot easier for them now. They'll get stuck and slaughtered less often. Combine that with 10 more armor, 1,000 more HP and 100 less gold cost, Star Dragons to Zombie Dragons and everything in between will be more affordable and more survivable. May or may not end up being enough for them, but it's a good start nonetheless. As for Mannfred himself, this is his new spell kit in custom and multiplayer. I have no reason to believe he won't have full access to both the Lore of Death and Lore of Vampires in campaign still, but he's mixed lore in custom with Doom and Darkness, Spirit Leech, Fate of Buna, Invocation of the Heck, Raise Dead, and Wind of Death. Really won't affect him too much there, although he might miss Soul Blight a little bit. The Black Coach got a huge rework in Game 3. It's been retooled significantly now. All three of its abilities have had their time in melee to activate conditions replaced with number of kills, which will better reflect how to use a chariot unit. Essentially, holding a chariot type unit in prolonged melee is kind of the opposite of what players should be doing. They should be focused on cycle charging and making sure it stays moving. So now the kill count is what matters, not how long it's in melee. And that means you'll be focused more on the killing aspect, the cycle charging aspect, working towards those higher tier abilities. Overall, it's going to be a lot better, more deadly, more awesome, better stats across the board. And I love that because it's super cool and frankly did not see enough play in Warhammer 2. Awesome model, cannot wait to see what it can do in Warhammer 3. Cryptors will be substantially better now too. 112 more HP per model, big boost to attack, defense, and plus 10 leadership, while hitting one extra target in melee. And vampiric units across the board have the Hunger, which will apply to Vargeist, the Devils of Schwarzhofen, Vargulfs, and Blood Knights. Now in the case of the Vargulf, it's losing regeneration, which it did have on the tabletop, so an interesting change there. That means it won't passively heal unless it's in melee, but it will be a lot more sustainable with that huge LD boost, so crumbling will be less of an issue for the Fat Bat, and it's honestly a pretty good campaign unit. I've never felt the need to disband it as Mannfred. I really like having it. It's a nice source of terror. It's also amazing for dueling enemy lords, especially if they're on foot. You can just stun like a foot lord forever. Blood Knights with the Hunger are going to be absolutely terrifying. Giving them a way to passively sustain themselves while feasting on routing units is very thematic and a great change for them. And the Terrorgeist, almost a different unit now, really. Common theme, boost LD and melee stats, give them more HP, mass, and staying power. They're just gonna be better. Now, a more interesting change is coming for Whites, Graveguard, and Black Knights. We're all getting magical attacks to help deal with demons and their innate physical resistance. Lower melee attack intervals means they attack faster and will ultimately have higher DPS against all targets, but they will be a really nice choice against the demonic factions, especially if you're going up against Bloodletters, Plague Bears, that sort of thing. Unfortunately, Black Knights are not receiving Strider, which is something they did indeed have on the tabletop, but that's presumably so they won't step on Hexwraith's toes. But they're being shifted into a more elite role now, trading big boosts in combat performance with a commensurate 25% increase in price. Black Knights at 750 really did seem too cheap for them, considering how powerful Whites and Graveguard are in the lore, so this is a thematic change, but will close the gap between Blood Knights and Black Knights considerably. Fellbats are getting some fun changes here too, with Vanguard and improved stats. Crypt Ghouls are looking extra spooky and will now innately become a stalking Vanguard deploying unit, while the Feasters in the Dust gain Frenzy, and Skeletons will hold the line longer in Warhammer 3 with their increased morale. Although they'll still probably adorn Khorne Skull Throne soon after entering melee combat with the Blood Gods Chosen. Overall, these changes to the counts will allow them to focus more on a grindy, attrition-focused playstyle against demons and melee-focused factions in general, like the Warriors of Chaos, but they will be a slightly more expensive faction as a result. Still remains to be seen whether or not the heal and leadership changes, particularly for the lower tier units, will maybe be a little bit too much, but overall, quite happy with this rework and excited to see what the Undead and Ethereals do on the battlefields of Immortal Empires. Hope this video was illuminating for you, and I'll see you all in the next video. Indie Pride, signing out for now. Have a good one, guys.